In this video, I discuss a scale of creative achievement implied by Hanz Prinzhorn in his pioneering text, The Artistry of the Mentally Ill. So the categories I will be discussing are focused on the characteristics of configuration that arise from an artist's inner psychic world as opposed to the customs and objects of external reality. So, Prinzhorn does not directly assign the title Scale of Creative Achievement to the 5 categories of recurring configuration types. However, he states, the more completely a picture's individual expressive content ripens into a more commonly understandable and communicative configuration, which it does independently of technical skill, the higher we will rank it as a creative achievement. He does not measure the drawings by the artistic merit, but instead attempts to understand them through a psychological lens. He describes, we expect to be able to trace the major characteristics of a work far back into the process of configuration, which, reduced to its essential features, will give these major characteristics prominence as clearly defined and described psychic functions. We also believe that the creative process, stripped of individual traits and of every relation to secondary elements, will allow to comprehend the metaphysical meaning of configuration, which civilization generally obscures by establishing extraneous ends. The scale I will be proposing in the following sections begin at point 0 and end at point 4. The categories are taken from Prinzhorn's text and are labelled as follows. Point 0. Unobjective and unordered scribbles. Point 1. Playful drawings with a predominant ordering tendency. Point 2. Playful drawings with a predominant copying tendency. Point 3. Visual fantasies. Point 4. Increased symbolic significance. This gradation is based on the increasing complexity of the configuration and the artist's ability to express a unique vision. So, unobjective and unordered scribbles is described by Prinzhorn as the predecessor of drawing. He states that it is the nearest to the 0 point on the scale of composition. The only intention of the artist when engaging with this configuration type is to satisfy the expressive urge. This category presents itself as random dramatic gestures without any formal elements. So according to Prinzhorn, the primary motivations behind any image-making activity is the expressive urge, which presents itself as a dark involuntary impulse to create. Prinzhorn bases this idea on Ludwig Klage's theory of expression. According to this theory, expressive gestures have the potential to enable the realization of psychic elements. Prinzhorn describes, from the purposeful movement of the arm, the gesture provoked by joy or anger, to the oral gesture of the word and its manifestation in writing or a picture, the individual psychological element is always communicated to us simply and directly, instead of by rational association. With regards to pictorial composition, the expressive urge is intricately linked with 2 other impulses, the playful urge and the decorative urge. These primary impulses present themselves as unobjective and unordered scribbles when there is no relation to formal tendencies. So Prinzhorn compares this style to a young child who scribbles between the ages of 2 and 4. He describes, to a child, scribbling is a game of movement, and nothing could be further from his mind than the possibility that it could actually be made to represent something. Unordered and unobjective scribbles is an informal configuration characteristic that is seen most in abstract expressionism, particularly in the practice of action painting. This style of abstraction emphasized the physical act of painting and focused on a creative process which was instinctual and direct. Artists of this type engage with the spontaneous application of dramatic sweeping brushstrokes and the chance effects of dripping and spilling paint onto a canvas. These frantic and scattered brushstrokes can be seen throughout the expressionist art movement. For example, Michelle West's Dancing Figure, Joan Mitchell's Ladybug, and Lee Krasner's Icarus. This type of configuration within the field of fine art is abundant and seemingly endless. It is therefore understandable that this category is the simplest on the scale. Playful drawings with a predominant ordering tendency refers to pictorial configurations which combine formal tendencies to unobjective and unordered scribbles. Alongside the expressive urge, it conveys a dominant playful urge, producing ornamental and decorative features and/or a rhythmic movement of line. This type of configuration is more complex than the previous category and marks point 1 on the scale of creative achievement. Prinzhorn describes play as an activity which follows certain rules but fulfills no purpose, other than to entertain and pass the time. According to him, play is an intuitive activity of which the whole personality resonates sympathetically. This playful urge presents itself as an incorrect perception of an object in undefined forms, such as seeing shapes in clouds or faces in abstract patterns. This free association game is called pareidolia and is a common human tendency in which naturally occurring or playfully created forms are not accepted for their objective face value. Prinzhorn describes, suppose that one scribbles aimlessly on a sheet of paper while averting their eyes and covers as much of the sheet as possible with a confusion of lines of variously strong and variously projecting curves, and only then, looking for the first time, lets himself be inspired by some composition or other, whether figure or landscape. According to Prinzhorn, the playful urge is a psychological fact which stems from the fantasy function. He believed it was crucial to underline the relationship of fantastic activity in its many ramifications to that simple playful urge which appears in every child and in all kinds of adults when they compose something. Prinzhorn believed that the inspiration that arises from pareidolia was not limited to childish drawings but also expresses itself in great art. To prove this point, he quotes Leonardo da Vinci, who, in his lifetime, discussed a newly invented kind of seeing which may appear narrow and almost ridiculous, but nevertheless inspires the mind to invent. It consists of this, that you look at many walls which are covered with all sorts of spots, or at a mixture of stones, or into the ashes in the fire, into the clouds of mud. If you observe them closely, you will discover wonderful inventions in them, compositions of battles, of animals and men, terrifying things like devils, streams or rocks, and lively arrangements of peculiar strange figures, facial expressions, dress, and uncounted things which you can bring to completion. Through entangles and undefined things, the mind is open to new inventions. So ornamental and decorative features can arise as formal elements from playful activity. Prinzhorn labels this as the ornamental urge, which is the desire to enrich the outer world by the addition of visual elements. He describes it as the urge in man not to be absorbed passively into the environment, but to impress on it traces of his existence beyond those of purposeful activity. This urge can be seen when we cover a piece of paper with doodles, when a child arranges colourful pebbles, and when we plant flowers in our garden. The ornamental urge presents itself as decorated objects that are created without any consideration for its practical purpose. These objects are dominated by rules and order, but these rules do not derive from the real and objective world, but rather from abstract order. Prinzhorn describes how the precise meaning of the ornament is that it first decorates, and secondly, it is governed by an intrinsic law, an order not dictated by the object but by abstract formal principles. These formal principles include linear arrangement, regular pattern, symmetry, and proportion. An example of this in the field of fine art can be seen in Paul Klee's red, green, and violet composition and Wassily Kandinsky's Composition 8. So in addition to the strict and measurable order of ornaments, Prinzhorn distinguishes a 3 and autonomous order which he called rhythm, a living, uniform movement of line which is only comparable to the pure melody of music. According to him, this rhythmic flow can create a stronger effect than all other formal elements. This rhythm presents itself as a gradual development of lines which is separate from the mechanical and exact uniformity of mathematical rules. He describes, one might object that such a loose definition of rhythm would promote an imprecise use, but the distinction between rhythm, meaning the sequence of similar quantities in similar chronological or spatial segments, and rules, meaning the exact and measurable sequence of equal quantities in equal or chronological spatial segments. This rhythmic flow can be seen in Georgina Houghton's Glory Be to God. This artist is known most notably for her spirit drawings, an astonishing collection of abstract watercolours that produced under the guidance of various spirits and angelic beings. Houghton believed that her images had healing properties which could benefit and influence anyone who encountered them. It is interesting to note that Houghton's spirit drawings predates the abstract expressionist movement by almost a century. Point 2. Playful drawings with a predominant copying tendency. So this category refers to the copying tendency, which is not directed towards a real and existent object, but draws freely from the fund of preconceptions. This type of configuration marks point 2 on the scale of creative achievement. In this text, Prinzhorn uses the term eidetic image to explain an individual's perceptual comprehension of their environment. He considered how, through the act of observation, an individual's perception is strongly shaped by their attitude and personality. He states, "Our eidetic image is not formed by the individual real and external object. Instead, we form a personal eidetic image out of this object by applying a personal system. Eidetic images can give form to intricate ideas or purely abstract concepts, which arise from the individual's attempts to interpret their experience of the external world through their 5 senses." This psychological process of understanding an image is unavoidable, as perception does not immediately result in the formed image. There also exists compulsions running counter to its aims. Realistic configurations, therefore, require an artist to transfer this eidetic image into a spatial and tangible format. So the imitative tendency is characterized by an artist's inclination towards depicting an eidetic image. Prinzhorn states, "What is of primary psychological importance is that the artist is determined by the eidetic image, and that it is completely secondary whether the object is painted realistically or abstractly. What is of true importance is the artist's ability to realize and convey their theme effectively to the viewer." He describes, "It is relatively unimportant which real objects are included. Everything now depends on whether the form components in the eidetic image suggest the theme powerfully enough that they bring others to mind by association. The eidetic image is made most intense, not by the addition of all parts to be found in memory, but through the selection and hierarchical arrangement of the visually most important." So the imitative tendency represents itself as a polarity, using the narrowest realism or the broadest abstraction. Prinzhorn describes, "When it comes to objective representation, there exists only a simple polarity between a materially bound proximity to nature and a more abstract formal remoteness from nature." He also describes these two configurative processes as a physioplastic one which sticks to nature and an ideoplastic one which adheres to conception and knowledge. So this polarity depends on whether the playful urge dominates or submits to the imitative tendency. When the artist allows the imitative tendency to dominate, he creates configurations which are intended as a reflection of the natural object or its immediate memory image. Prinzhorn discusses this category with a level of contempt, stating that it has for far too long and continues to be the most popular. He describes how this tendency has been the most important goal in pictorial configuration for millennia and can be seen in Dutch paintings and realism, which were guided by the tradition of art schools. Prinzhorn states that the ingenuous imitative urge matched the outlook of the times, which were increasingly dedicated to a materialistic reality cult, very damaging to artistic culture. However, when the playful urge dominates the imitative tendency, the configuration is not directed towards the real and objective world and instead draws freely from the fund of preconceived ideas. In this category, mental processes remodel natural subjects, resulting in a more unique and personalized configuration. Popular examples of this type include Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night and George Brock's Violin and Candlestick. Georgia O'Keeffe is also a prime example of an artist from this category. The artist is known for her unique fusion of realism and abstraction. She successfully pictured her inner experience by playfully engaging with imagery of landscapes, flowers, and other natural objects. Her painting, titled Jimson Weed, shows the image of a flower relatively unedited by abstraction. In contrast, her painting Blue Flower turns away from the objective image and instead focuses on a unique selection of the most prominent and sensuous characteristics. Both of these paintings belong to this category as they were inspired by an eidetic image of nature. Point 3. Visual fantasies. So to reiterate, when the playful urge dominates the imitative tendency, mental processes remodel natural subjects, resulting in a more unique and personalized configuration. When this point is pushed a step further, visual fantasies are depicted. In this category, the need for symbols begin to emerge. This configuration type is considered more complex than the previous category and marks point 3 on the scale of creative achievement. To grasp Prinzhorn's comprehension of this category, it is important to consider how he defined the symbol. He declares that symbolic significance can be seen first in an effigy, the representation or imitation of an object. He uses the relationship between early tribal communities and effigies to consider the relevance of symbolic significance, stating that there exists 3 variations or relationships. So number 1, the effigy is a personified object which possesses magical powers. The idol is itself a demon, for example, a rock resembling a person who is conceived in such a personal way as to be the subject of abuse if he does not perform to his owner's expectations. Number 2, the effigy is part of the model. Whatever happens to the image also happens to him who is represented by it. For example, the belief that if I decapitate the effigy, the one whom it represents will also lose their head due to a magically transmitted effect. Number 3, the effigy is the sacred habitat of the demon or the soul. The sacredness of the effigy's location is often decisive on whether the soul lives there or not. So in the first 2 examples, the effigy is an idol and possesses magical powers, whereas the third example is a symbol, a representation of a force which exists independently from the image. The symbol implies magic. According to Prinzhorn, idols no longer exist in modern forms of thought. The symbol, however, remains alive with minor transformations in popular customs and church ceremonies. In this category, the external object loses inherent value and is instead a primary material of which to project inwardly directed psychic processes. Prinzhorn describes, although objects have lost their inherent value and are no longer anything of and by themselves, they serve as bearers and representatives for the psychic movements of the artists. According to Prinzhorn, this habit of using external objects as primary material leads even relatively modest talents into a more or less symbolic, but nevertheless firm and consistent language of form, into a personal style. Prinzhorn states that the more naturalistic the work, the more unlikely it is to have symbolic significance. He continues, if, on the other hand, there appear combinations of forms or familiar objects which are not in common experience, some kind of psychic process must have taken place within their author from which the combination resulted. Configurations of this type have a strange and eerie quality, and because of the ambiguity, it is impossible to attribute any rational meaning to it. Prinzhorn describes, it crumbles into numerous single motifs, each of which seems to want to say something original without finding the saving expression. An example of this type of configuration can be seen abundantly in the Surrealist art movement, such as Salvador Dali's Swans Reflecting Elephants. This category can present itself in 2 ways. The artist relies on traditional symbols to convey the meaning, or they create new ones for themselves. In the first instance, churches and popular customs become the source of inspiration for the artists. They move within a customary conceptual world. This style dominated Renaissance art and can be seen in such works as Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus and Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. A more recent example is Reverend Mackenzie Long's The Damned Are Cast into the Lake of Fire and Brimstone. In the second instance, the artist is preoccupied with a personal philosophical battle and intends on combining their instincts with cultural forces. Prinzhorn describes this as obscure and fascinating. They use traditional symbols spontaneously or, from another point of view, intuitively add new meanings to old symbols, or even create new ones out of their own conflicts, perhaps with the aid of reading. This configuration type can be seen in Peter Berghauser's Eternal Youth and Max Ernst's Oedipus Rex. So Leonora Carrington is another artist who successfully depicted her visual fantasies by intuitively combining her unique vision with cultural forces. A prime example is her painting titled The House Opposite, which depicts a cutaway view of a domestic environment. The multi-chambered dwelling is full of female figures, many of whom are busily engaged in the preparation, presentation, and consumption of food. Carrington is representing the female role in the domestic environment with invented symbolic characters and pre-existing symbols such as the Virgin Mary in the upper left-hand corner. Point 4. Increased symbolic significance. So increased symbolic significance refers to a category of configuration which depicts purely symbolic content with limited reference to external forces. This category combines emotional and psychic elements through abstraction and symbolic content. Marking point 4 on the scale of creative achievement. So the previous category explored the need for symbols by referencing external and cultural elements such as the domestic environment in Leonora Carrington's The House Opposite or the natural environment in Dali's Swans Reflecting Elephants. Prinzhorn describes this characteristic as rational content, which increases the significance of the scene beyond the impression which the drawn alone is able to give. He continues by stating that the rational content distracts attention from the pure psychic expression which can only be depicted symbolically, in the sense that rhythm of lines, the relations between lines, and the symbolism of colours communicate emotional experience to us. This configuration type emphasizes formal convention, rhythmical solemnity, and the dominance of abstract geometric elements. The superiority of the need for symbolic content promotes order and uses conventional or unique symbols to express the artist's psychic experience. For example, Hilma af Klint's Dove No. 2 and Carl Jung's Mandela 107. Another interesting artist who engages with this configuration type is Adolf Wolfli, the quintessential outsider artist. Wolfli's painting Bengali Firework excludes any rational content and instead expresses abstract geometric order and increased symbolic significance.